Part 15. Here we are at Daniel chapter 9. The 9th chapter of Daniel is one passage in which is traditionally used to gather information about years that would prove that Jesus came at the time predicted from this chapter, thus proving that he is the Messiah. This chapter is usually used to take calculations given here to plug into the calendar as the time Jesus would be prophesied to come. However, is there another contextual way of looking at this? Is there something more accurate we can gather here? I can first note that with something this huge as the messianic claim would be, it would seem like it would be like the motherlode of all prophecies, you know what I mean? And if this is the motherlode of all prophecies, the one that would be proof down to the year that Jesus would die, then why didn't any of the first century authors even mention it? I mean, if something in the Tanakh made a prediction down to the year that something came true, that's definitely something I would pay attention to. If I were a first century believer, I think I would have added this fulfillment as the main way to show that Jesus was fulfilling the timeline given in Daniel 9, because, I mean, you can't mess up the calculations of years, right? Or are we missing something? I just find it interesting that there are crickets chirping in the New Testament when it comes to this passage. Could it be that perhaps the first century authors understood the passage in context and therefore did not morph it into a messianic allusion? And secondly, I can note that the years that the Christian scholar used for the calculations land us sometime around 39 AD, or at least that's what I gather from what I've read. Oops, something's wrong. 39 AD is not a significant year. Even with the calculations given by Christian scholars, it does not match up perfectly to Jesus. So was Yehovah just not able to make a radical prophecy come true? Did he have to compensate somewhere for a time gap here? Are we sure this was to be alluding to Jesus? Before going into the actual 9th chapter of Daniel, let's get a little backstory. Whenever we are looking at a passage, I would think it would always be a good idea to go to the beginning and look at everything that came before the passage, because if we don't, we're prone to not understanding what is happening in the passage, and that could be the case here with Daniel 9. In Daniel chapter 1, we are told about the capture of Judah, and we are told that it is Yehovah himself that gave them over to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And we are told that all the men without spot or blemish would be taken over to Babel to be taught the ways of the Babylonians. And Daniel, of course, was one of them, from the tribe of Judah, a Jew. A Jew, duh. Sorry, little pun. Somebody from the tribe of Judah would be called a Jew. Jew is short for Jew, duh. Anyways, so why did Yehovah allow them to go into captivity in the first place? We find in Leviticus chapter 25 that when the Israelites were to go into the promised land, they were to observe a 7th year Sabbath land rest. And this is known as the Shemitah year. They were not to sow their fields, and everyone, including servants, would be given a whole year of rest. I wish we still did that today, right? How awesome would it be to get like a whole year off every 7th year? Wow, that would just be amazing. Anyways, so we know that with Israel, this didn't end up happening. Israel did not observe the Shemitah, and we can read about what happened in 2 Chronicles 36, 18 through 21. This is also explaining, paralleling to the book of Daniel, that the people of Judah were sent into the Babylonian exile, and that the utensils of the temple were taken, and the temple was burned down. Also explained in the 2 Chronicles chapter is that Judah would remain in captivity until the reign of Persia. This chapter also states this was so in order to fulfill the word of Yehovah spoken to Jeremiah, that because of their disobedience to allow the land to rest, they would remain in captivity until 70 years was complete. Now Daniel is one who knows about the 70-year punishment because of their lack of observing the Shemitah year. Daniel is familiar with the writings of the prophet Jeremiah, who spoke of this, and Daniel knows why they are in Babylon. We know this from Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, where it says that Daniel is contemplating the words of Yehovah spoken to Jeremiah regarding the desolation of Jerusalem. At this point, that is being described here at Daniel 9, is when that 70 years is almost to a completion. And Daniel knows what should be starting to take place, and Judah should be set free from their exile. So this is why the Jews were there, and that's where we are here in the book of Daniel. I have to take a minute to pause for a second, because I have to remind myself, as well as my reader or listener here, to set aside the preconceived notions about this passage. And obviously that's gone for every single other passage that we can observe and look at. And I know that's hard. Can we look at these passages as though we have fresh eyes and have never read it before? I mean, it can't hurt anything, right? Can we look at it from the perspective of a BC era reader? Please read chapter 9 if it's in its entirety, if you have a moment. In the first part of chapter 9, Daniel is observing the number of years the prophet Jeremiah had spoken regarding the captivity of Judah, the 70 literal years. And he is making supplication for them and praying, confessing iniquity. He acknowledges that it's by their own doing that they are in captivity because of their own sin. Daniel acknowledges that Yehovah has confirmed his word which he had spoken about. What would befall them if they had not observed the land Sabbaths, or the Shemitah? In verse 20 of Daniel 9, we are told that while Daniel is praying, it was the messenger Gabriel whom came to him and gave him encouragement and instruction, as well as understanding of his night visions. He is given insight of what is to come upon Judah in the future. Remember that at this point, the temple had been burned down to rubble and is not standing. Jerusalem is not Jerusalem, but taken over by the Babylonians. Starting in verse 24, Gabriel states to Daniel that 70 weeks of years have been decreed for the people of Judah and Jerusalem to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, and bring in everlasting righteousness. So here he is speaking about 1 week of years that would be equal to a 7-year period. So 70 weeks of years, as we are talking about here, is a period of 490 years. One thing to note is that in this vision, there are 2 different periods of time that are being spoken about. And I definitely missed this a long time ago. So you just got to pay attention to it. So if I tell you that my great aunt is 60 years and 5 years old, why would I phrase it that way? Why would I not just say my great aunt is 65 years old, And this is typical of Hebrew phrasing when speaking about 2 different periods of time. So in this chapter, we are dealing with a period of 7 weeks of years, and another period of time being 62 weeks of years, and they can overlap too. So there are 2 different sets of periods being worked with here. Also, as a side note, as I have spoken before about the term Mashiach, it's the Hebrew word for Messiah, or also known in English sometimes as anointed. This word occurs 38 times in the Tanakh. Mashiach occurs 38 times in the Tanakh. And only twice do English translators actually translate this word as Messiah instead of anointed in the English language. Yeah, well, guess which 2 those would be? Bingo! The 2 times in this chapter is it Mashiach instead of anointed one that the translators chose to use. Agenda much in this English language? I'm kind of thinking so. Remember that there were many Mashiachs, or many Messiahs to Israel, such as King David and King Saul. And not to mention every priest who served in the temple would have been called a Messiah. So here in Daniel 9, the term Messiah or Mashiach used is to describe a person who has been physically anointed to serve the purpose of Yehovah. And this could describe a whole number of different people. Ironically, a pagan king named King Cyrus, who was not even a part of Israel, was a Messiah to Yehovah. Why? Because he served the purpose for Yehovah and his people. And you can see this in Isaiah 45 verse 1. So during those first 49 years, or 7 weeks of years, we have the king of Persia, who was a Messiah to Israel. and the one described also in 2 Chronicles who would bring an end to the captivity. So yes, even a pagan who does not know Yehovah can be a Messiah to Israel. I laugh, because doesn't that just sound weird saying after all these years of only associating the word Messiah with Jesus? But that's the problem with our perspective and how we have been taught to look at things. How we are taught is tainted, thus we look at things through Jesus or religious colored glasses. Again, I digress. Sorry, that happens a lot. So in this chapter, we are dealing with what Gabriel is telling Daniel will happen. This comes in 2 different sets of times. The period of the total 490 years begins with the rebuilding of Jerusalem, which would include the temple. So in 7 weeks of years, or 49 years after the word goes out to restore Jerusalem, then there will be an appearance of an anointed ruler. After this happens a period of 62 weeks of years, or 434 years. Jerusalem will be built up again, but during hard times. Then after this period of 434 years, an anointed ruler shall be cut off and be nothing. Keep in mind that this is a different anointed ruler from the one described in the last sentence, because no one at this point has ever lived for over 400 years. And note in verse 26, it is phrased after the 62 weeks. In Hebrew, again, this indicates a confirmation that this is its own period of time. And again, at the end of this 434 years, a people of a coming prince shall destroy Jerusalem. And it indicates that it'll be this way until the end of ends. And this coming prince, who, if you pay attention, is spoken of as an enemy of Yehovah and Israel, this coming prince, who seems to be an enemy, will be the one to put an end to slaughtering and meal offerings. This coming prince happens in the last week of years, totaling again to the full 70 weeks of years. We have that accounted for. What sticks out to me is that given the information, to plug Jesus back into any part of this makes Jesus become the bad guy, at least for the part of the prince, the coming prince dude. I've heard it said that Jesus was the coming prince who put an end to offering because of his sacrifice. And I scratched my head on that one because that means he was the initiator of the one who destroyed the city. This coming prince spoken about is not spoken of highly in this chapter. This was an enemy of Elohim, and no one in the Christian world, I don't think, would consider Jesus an enemy of God. When the second temple was destroyed and laid waste by the Roman Empire, then yes, there would definitely be an end to offerings, because without a temple, there can be no offerings. You know what I mean? We are told in other clear and consistent prophecies that in the end of ends, or when the coming Messiah comes, he will restore the temple, and sacrifices and offerings will be reinstated, as well as the Levites. But for now, it has held true that according to Daniel 9, it shall lay waste until the complete end. And we are waiting for it to be restored and look forward to that day. So if this isn't about Jesus, then who in the heck is it about? Well, let's take a look. An aspect of this passage I want to explore is what would the starting date be then for the decree to go out that's mentioned in this chapter. This would be our starting point for the 70 weeks of years described in Daniel 9. And there were 4 different decrees you could choose from when trying to figure out what starting point he was talking about. Conveniently, the decree given by the king of Persia, Artaxerxes, to Nehemiah, is picked because it comes closest to the death of Jesus. And here you have another example of first believing in Jesus, then having to morph everything else around him, even if it's not accurate. But if you remember, it is almost a decade off date. Like, it really doesn't match up. It gets close, but it's just not quite there. If you remember from Daniel, the decree was for Jerusalem to be rebuilt. The king of Persia gave, here Artaxerxes, the one that Christians usually choose, gave permission to rebuild some of the walls, but it was not the city per se he gave a decree to be able to rebuild. The city there was already intact, so this option from Nehemiah would really be a poor choice to choose out of the few options that we have. And here are our other options to look at where decrees to actually rebuild the city came from. One was from King Darius in Ezra chapter 6. There was a different Artaxerxes in Ezra chapter 7, and that's different from the Nehemiah Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is like a common title, just like Pharaoh is a common title, but it's a different dude. Okay, and then of course we have King Cyrus in 2 Chronicles 36. So we have 3 other choices here to look at, besides the first Artaxerxes in Nehemiah. There is an interesting word that sticks out if you look at all the comparisons. And between these kings who are giving out decrees that are being sent out. In verse 25 of Daniel 9, it says that from the time of the going forth of the word to rebuild Jerusalem. So some translations use the word command or issuing or whatnot. But the key term here is word, or in Hebrew it's called dabar, from Yehovah. Now, interestingly, if we go and look at all of our options, as I have listed above, what kings would send out a word or a dabar to rebuild, that actually falls on King Cyrus in 2 Chronicles 36. This is the only place that uses the word dabar and matches up with what Daniel 9 has to say from Yehovah within our options. So if this is the beginning of the time period, who are the characters being spoken of here in this period of 7 and 62 weeks of years, as well as the last week of years? Well, we know that in the first 49 years, the anointed one, or the Messiah, is King Cyrus, who issued the word to rebuild. Cyrus was called Yehovah's anointed, or Messiah, in Isaiah. Then we are told that after 434 years, an anointed will be cut off and be left to nothing or have nothing. The Hebrew phrase of being cut off is not a phrase to describe someone's death, but to describe being cut off because he is not righteous of character. So the question is, who was cut off? When you do a little digging into the first century and discover just how corrupt the priests and Levitical system had become, it is no wonder why they would have been cut off and taken over by the Romans. Remember, the word anointed or Messiah can refer to many people. There have been many Messiahs in the time of Israel. It's just not, when you're looking at it with Christian glasses, all you can think of is Jesus, but that's just not accurate. There have been many Messiahs to Israel. The Levitical priests were all Messiahs. The Messiah cut off in Daniel chapter 26 is not an indication of death per se, but of being cut off because they were not righteous of character. And this goes together with the people of a coming prince who will destroy the temple and city. That's exactly what happened. If you can take some time and see what was happening in the first century with the temple and the priesthood, you will quickly find out how corrupt it had become. And no wonder Yehovah cut it off. I would encourage you to look up a first century man by the name of Agrippa II. He was born in 27 CE. He was called a prince in his time, who originally took an interest to the Jews and their welfare. In 48, he received authority over temple affairs and became the king of Chalcis 2 years later. Though he supported the rights of the Jews, he faced backfire from the Hellenized populace and began to avoid politics in Judea. Ultimately, when trouble broke out amongst Rome, Agrippa assisted Roman operations. We know the rest of the story. The temple was destroyed, and Jerusalem had found its waste in whole form around 70 AD, and it waits for the end to be restored by the coming Messiah. We look forward and pray that that time will come soon when Yehovah will deliver and regather the remnant of Israel. To plug Jesus into chapter 9 in Daniel is to greatly mangle it and make it more difficult to understand than it already is. And at the end of the day, even if I were to consider this to somehow be about Jesus, nothing about it is clear and the dates don't match up without extensive loopholes and conspiracy theories. I really couldn't make a case for Jesus here in full certainty, nor apparently did any New Testament writer even bother with this one. I won't pretend that I understand everything in its 100% fullness about what Daniel is being told, but I also rest assured that even Daniel himself was very troubled by all this and didn't know what to make of it as well. So that is the end of this part.